anybody who's ever heard me talk before knows that dollars and gold are two of my favorite topics. I think they're each equally important, and I think they're each equally misunderstood by many people in the world. And it's my interest in these two topics that led me to my dollar milkshake theory. Now, for those of you who have heard of this dollar milkshake theory before, don't worry, I'm not going to go through it again. I know many are sick of hearing it. But for those who haven't, I'm just going to run through quickly what it was and what it said. A long story short, it was essentially a framework for understanding the capital flows as a result of a potential sovereign debt crisis as a result of too much debt in the world. We did not get the crisis, but the framework helped explain a lot of the things that went on in the markets. We thought that after a 40-year bull market, bonds were finally going to fall and interest rates were going to rise. And while interest rates initially went down, they eventually went up in a big way. And as interest rates went up, bonds fell fairly dramatically. We also thought the US dollar would rise versus its fiat peers during that time period, which it has. And kind of controversial is we thought US equities would do extremely well in this environment, despite interest rates going higher and the dollar going higher. And it has. And then we also said that even though interest rates and the dollar were going to go higher versus its foreign competitors, that we thought gold would go higher. And it has. So while we didn't get the crisis, it definitely helped us understand what was going on in the world. And so I'm not surprised to see gold at $5,000 and the DXY index still trading in the high 90s. And I think this is really kind of an important thing for people to understand, because I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is underestimating or misunderstanding their opponent. And I don't even really think dollars and gold are necessarily always opponents. They can certainly be headwinds, but they don't necessarily have to be enemies. And I think if everybody were to stop predicting the imminent demise of the US dollar, it would help them understand what's going on in the world a lot better. Because all the arguments being made about the US dollar today were being made 50 years ago. When the United States took the dollar off the gold standard, the world was outraged. They hated it. They said they were never going to do business with the United States again. And at a G8 conference in Italy, they surrounded Treasury Secretary Connolly and told him he needed to do something about it. And his answer was, the dollar may be our currency, but it's your problem. And 50 years later, it still is. And I would argue that that comment that he made 50 years ago is as true today as it was then. But it's not just about the dollar. It's also about the U.S. economy. The whole economy that the U.S. is trying to, reinvent has huge implications for the rest of the world. And while many people think it automatically is going to fail, I would encourage you not to jump to such quick conclusions. We've written pretty extensively about some of the efforts that the United States is making to retain their place on the global stage. And you can find these at santiagocapital.com. And again, I don't have the time to go into detail on all of these today. I'm going to cover them quickly, but I would encourage you to research these topics yourself. Because while many people are, again, predicting the imminent fall of the United States as a hegemon and the global reserve currency, I would argue the U.S. is very quickly building the castle walls higher and thicker than ever before. Now, from the U.S. dollar perspective, it all goes around the Genius Act. And oftentimes when I see an act and a law come out, I think that the name is totally wrong because it usually implies the exact opposite of what's going to happen. But in this case, I actually think it's true. This is a pretty clever way for the United States to retain global hegemony on the dollar, and I'll go over why. But make no mistake, one way or the other, there's a huge revolution happening and a profound shift in global money. Codes and ledgers are no longer just a form of rebellion against the state. It is now being co-opted by state powers and used to their advantage against the citizens. And I think this has been a long-running competition between individual rights and state power, especially in the last kind of 10 or 15 years. Bitcoin proved that code and computers and blockchains can verify transactions and act as a monetary system. And the Eurodollar system that's been created over the last 50 years proved that money can be created outside the jurisdiction of the United States government. And stablecoins, I think, are the next evolution of this process. And I think US dollar stablecoins will very possibly re-dollarize the world as opposed to de-dollarizing the world. Now, a stablecoin at the end of the day is really just a digital representation of something else. It doesn't have any value of its own. It's a digital representation of something else that has value. In this case, we're talking about the US dollar, but the same thing could apply to gold or copper or something else. And one of the highlights that this has been raised, that this is a way for the United States to create new demand for the debt that it needs to sell. And while I don't think that that's wrong, and I think it will create a little bit of new demand, I think that fundamentally misunderstands the real strategic value of the US dollar stablecoins. I think the real value is the fact that they have the potential to steal sovereignty from other countries around the world. But to really understand this, we first need to understand this question. Like, what is money? Everybody says they know what money is, but if you ask them to define it, it's really tough. It's really difficult. But I think this is an explanation, or this is a definition that most people are comfortable with. The most marketable commodity, which extinguishes debt, that has been chosen by free market forces. How many people like this definition? Okay. Well, I do too. That's actually my preferred definition. The problem is there's this little thing called government, and they don't like that definition. And as much as we might not like them being in charge, they are. And this is where situational awareness comes in. It's one thing to have a personal preference and a personal belief system. But if you're in prison and the biggest, strongest guy tells you that cigarettes are money, are you going to argue with him, or are you going to pay him in cigarettes? Money also has a duality. It's the market's choice for liquidity, but it's also the expression of what the king wants in tribute. And it can be a form of control. Now, sometimes you have a free market, and sometimes you have a somewhat free market, and sometimes you don't have a free market at all. But the point is, you have to have the situational awareness to understand which environment you're currently in. And control, regardless of which the answer is, control is a big part of what money is. And seigniorage is the biggest part of the power that a government gets, because they get to control the money in their realm. And seigniorage is essentially the right to be able to print money for nothing and get value in return. This is why states hate gold. They don't want to have handcuffs put on them. They want to be able to put the handcuffs on others. And this is where we need to understand sovereignty as well. Because to understand sovereignty means to have absolute power, to be beholden to nobody. You cannot be sovereign and be beholden to a money that you cannot control. And any form of dependence on someone else is some form of subjugation. So adoption of US dollar stablecoins by economies other than the United States starts to steal into the sovereignty of other authorities or other political regimes. We've seen the same thing in the euro dollar market for years. Again, in the 1970s, after the US left gold, the world had the opportunity to do something other than use the dollar. But they didn't. Instead, they doubled down, and they took the euro dollar market and grew it exponentially. And now they have a euro dollar prison that they would very much like to get out of, but it's much easier to say than to actually do. And part of it is because of the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is kind of the central intelligence or the central nervous system of the entire monetary order. Now, this is a European institution, but the United States has more control over it than kind of anybody else. But the problem is they don't have full control, and any sovereign wants full control. And so for the last 20 years, 25 years, especially since 9/11, they have fought a war on the SWIFT system. And they have looked into how can they control the flow of money and how they can increase their ability to sanction regimes. And they realize that stablecoins could be a way to eventually replace the traditional euro dollar system that would work faster, more efficiently, more cheaply, and therefore be more quickly adopted, but then also give them absolute control. From a financial sovereignty standpoint, they could, without this system, it could be used to de-dollarize or other systems could de-dollarize. But if they are able to encourage the citizens of these other countries to hold US dollar stablecoins rather than local currencies, because even though the dollar is a horrible currency, their local currencies are even worse, all of a sudden, the US has another weapon that it can yield. And make no mistake, money is a weapon. And the US Army has known this for decades. And it is an institutionalized policy that they teach all of their generals to implement in the field. So this is not some, theoretical idea of mine. Money has been weaponized by the US government, by the US military for decades. And this new extension via stablecoins would just be the latest iteration. But long story short, the Genius Act is, in our opinion, is the United States' preemptive move to make sure another digital Eurodollar system is not created that they don't control. And we think that they are going to use it to increase control rather than to lose it. From a US Treasury perspective, many people think that this is the only benefit of doing it. But we think it is actually much greater than that. Because while treasuries will have to be bought to back these, what it really does is institute a more thorough form of global seigniorage to the United States. They would no longer just have seigniorage within the United States, they would have seigniorage on a global level. And the stats already kind of prove this. The stablecoin market is growing incredibly quickly. But 99% of stablecoins are already US dollars. And most of the stablecoins are used outside the United States rather than inside the United States. And so this is a geopolitical issue, not a US domestic issue. And while the de-dollarization argument never dies, the United States dollar still overwhelmingly dominates the fiat world. And stablecoins would only reinforce this. Now, I know this is a gold conference, and I know everybody loves gold, as do I. And gold is reasserting itself as an important part of geopolitics and the monetary system. And we don't necessarily think this is going to change. Again, we're not surprised that we've seen gold rise as the dollar has held up versus its fiat peers. But just because gold has risen doesn't mean the United States has lost any ground versus its fiat peers. And unless we go back to a completely gold standard, the US dollar is still in dominant position. In other words, this is a fiat versus fiat competition, not a fiat versus gold competition. And stablecoins, we think, will be able to help the United States win that competition. Long story short, stablecoins are a technological innovation with profound geopolitical implications. It's a convergence of technology, finance, power, and statecraft. But again, as I said, it's not just stablecoins. It's not just the US dollar, it's also the US economy. The US, and Trump specifically, have been weaponizing the US economy against the rest of the world. Now, the tariffs are just one example. And I know the popular narrative is that the tariff war failed for Trump. But the reality is in a one-year period, the average tariff that the United States was receiving went from 3% to over 15%. Now, perhaps it's not as big as he one time wanted it to be, and perhaps this isn't the grand victory that he envisioned, but it's hard to look at this and say, when the stock market's still at its all-time high, when unemployment is still low, when inflation is no longer screaming higher, that this is a complete defeat either. So I think you got to take your emotions out of it and just look at the cold hard numbers. That is a huge change that Trump was able to get past in a fairly short period of time. There's a lot of other things that they're doing. Most specifically, the Big Beautiful Bill. Now, the Big Beautiful Bill is an economic renaissance program kind of designed at the entire American economy. And it's a way to become more self-sufficient in the Western Hemisphere than depending heavily on China. It was enacted about 6 or 7 months ago, and I think there was a part of it that people just totally missed. And that was that the Pentagon got specific funding from this. And while it was initially announced at $100 billion, which is a huge number, it's actually gone up to $200 billion since then, and it's on track to grow even more than that. And the role that they are having is they are aiming specifically at natural resources and technology to make the United States secure from China. And it's part of a broader national security perspective. They're trying to strengthen the industrial base, but they're doing it via partnership with private investors and the government. They're going to get private fund managers to raise money from their clients to invest in these industries that the government will then provide leverage or additional funding to help solve. Now, I know there's some people out there saying, well, this is very fascist and this is very communist and this is going to end really, really badly because government cannot allocate capital. And I tend to agree with that. But that's further down the road. And as proof, I would just point to China. This is what China has done for the last 25 years. And this is why China has grown so much in the last 25 years. So while it may end in neglect and rot and misallocated capital, in the short term, a lot of money is going to go into some specific industries in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere. And that is going to have huge implications for global capital markets. Essentially what they're going to do is the Pentagon is going to has already identified specific industries and specific materials and specific natural resources that they want developed. And there's a chain of command. It goes from Trump, then it goes to Secretary Hegseth, and then it goes to a guy named Steve Feinberg. And I'll come back to him in a second. So this is very much a wartime economy footing during a time we're not, at least yet, at war. But essentially, they're going to aim it at these specific critical minerals and industries and provide funding to companies that might not otherwise be able to get it because they are too new, they are pre-revenue, or they have a new technology that they've developed but just cannot bring it to market at this time. But these are some of the different technologies that they're looking at, whether it's microelectronics, nanomaterials, biochemicals, sensors, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the minerals are things like rare earths, lithium, graphite, cobalt, a lot of the things that we're interested in here in this room. And these are relatively small markets at this point. And the amount of money that's going to go into these areas is going to swamp the available supply. And that should do wonders for price. Now let me come back to Steve Feinberg for a second, because Steve Feinberg is not a typical government bureaucrat who gets allocated a couple $100 billion and just hands it out. Steve Feinberg founded a firm called Cerberus, which is one of the most successful private equity funds in history. He has made billions of dollars for himself and his clients, year after year after year. He hates losing money, and he hates losing, period. And he has basically been tasked with being the quarterback for the United States to bring all of the resources of the United States government, channel it through the Pentagon, and make the United States independent from an economic perspective. They are going to then partner, and he's going to act as a quarterback between the Department of Energy, the Small Business Administration, the U.S. Treasury, the Federal Reserve, et cetera, to partner with investment managers to then make loans to the private sector. You've probably heard the U.S. government took an investment in MP Materials. That was the Office of Strategic Capital. That was Steve Feinberg. You probably heard that they made an investment into Intel. That was the Office of Strategic Capital. That was Steve Feinberg. That is going to continue, and it's going to ramp up more than anybody realizes. The gold and silver have not yet been mentioned, but that would not surprise me at all. But essentially, this is a 21st century Manhattan Project by the United States government. Now, I don't know if it will be ultimately successful. I don't know who will ultimately win this race. But what I do know is the U.S. government is not going to lay down and give up. And anytime the U.S. has ever had to win a war, they have. So for anybody thinking the U.S. is automatically going to lose this race and that cannot possibly win, I would encourage you to think a little differently. Now, I said that they're going to partner with investment managers. We are not one of those investment managers, but we are partnered with one of them that is. And we are going to be investing in this, and we are excited about the opportunities. And if any of you are accredited investors and are interested in how we are doing it, you can let me know. You can find more information at Santiago Capital, or you can email me at brent@santiagocapital.com. Thank you for listening.